Issue 28 is in the house, Steve. Nile. Ooh, I can't wait. Give it to.
Boom!
Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Issue 28 of the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show on the Pop XP. We got the big guy over here, Steve Baby Thanos. That's my new nickname because a shout out to Jim Stalin. I love that. One of the greatest panels of all time. And down below, we got Nile with, hey, where's Billy Tucci? Maybe he'll be here in a few episodes. What's going on, Nile?
Hey, let me put my book down real quick here. Man, you know what's going on. I'll tell you what, man, everyone out there, you need to look below. You need to click that subscribe button, smash that bell, and get notifications when we go live and upload awesome episodes like tonight's episodes. And gentlemen, I'm happy to be back. We had a little time off, some great conventions going on, a little San Diego. Steve, John, let's rock and roll, guys.
Yeah, first now, we advertise ourselves as being almost weekly, and that's kind of hard when we get into the heyday of the cons and all that stuff. All of us all have stuff to do, so people out there, have patience with us. Now, but Steve, now, this show, what we usually do is about history, right? We know the guys with it. We know Steve knows his stuff, his Overstreet stuff. Niall knows his 90s stuff. But there's another guy we got here today. An author. I'm going to say one of the best biographies out on Stan Lee was ever written by this guy because he did it down the middle, but an editor worked them out. What book is that now? Why don't you show that one more time?
What do you mean? I'm trying to catch it over here. It's hot. It's still hot right now.
What do you have to say about this guy, Steve? What's going on? We got somebody here today.
Yeah, this is a fascinating aspect of what our show is about, because if you were reading Marvel Comics in the 1980s and early 1990s, you kept seeing in the credit box, Danny Fingeroth, editor. Now, he was there for a lot of important events and will have first-hand accounts of all sorts of juicy details. So this is what this show is about. We are going to get to learn about Danny. He's going to give us some of his first-hand accounts, and then we're going to drill down into the weeds and get some nice, juicy material.
And juicy it's going to be. Now, why don't we do something and bring the man out here? Because let's have some good old-fashioned conversation about the history and our love of comics. I can't wait to see what he likes because he's a big fanboy, too. And that's why he's one of those guys that made it through the rank, a la Roy Thomas. He's one of those guys that was a fan and kind of made it into the industry and made his mark. Woo! Danny Fingeroth, it's in the house!
So, should I have brought my lawyer? Sounds like you guys are really going to ask me. It sounds more like a deposition than an interview. But, okay.
Well, thank you for being here, Danny. It's always
the questions.
Everybody, great to be here.
But thank you for being here, Danny. One of the reasons why I wanted you on is because I watch you a lot online. I stalk you here and there. But I love how you do those panels. You're just fresh back from San Diego Comic-Con, and you do a bunch of panels. I want to know all about you. We all got questions for you. But number one, what we want to do, Danny, how did you get here? Why are you here in this industry? And how do you know so much? Little Danny Fingeroth in the streets of New York, I think. Is that true?
Oh yes, I was quite the ruffian in the streets of New York, all the way from the mean streets of the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It was a tough struggle. I say that humorously, but actually in the pre-gentrification days, I grew up kind of on what I call the wrong side of Lexington Avenue. It was the bad old days of kind of New York when it was kind of dangerous. I'm not claiming that I wasn't Jack Kirby on the Lower East Side, having street fights, luckily. But I grew up on a block where there was literally a brewery down the block. You ever heard of the New York Yankees? They were owned
so.
they were owned by a guy named Colonel Rupert, who made his money in Rupert Knickerbocker beer. Well, the Rupert Brewery was on 91st Street and 3rd Avenue, and really extended from 90th to 92nd. So what is now, this giant, ultra wealthy skyscraper complex, when I was a kid, was literally a brewery. They were making beer on East 91st Street. It was a little, and I'm oldish, but I'm not quite that old. But in the memories of a lot of people, so that's where I started from, and I went to a what's called the yeshiva, which is kind of like a Jewish Catholic school, except it's Jewish. I guess that would be a big difference between that and Catholic school. But, it was a certain kind of religious combined with secular education, and there were maybe 50 kids in my class, and maybe 3 or 4 of us were really, really into comic books. Everybody read comics for a year or two, but there were 3 or 4 of us who were really into it. And once when I was about 12, my friend David Sable and I went up to the Marvel offices. That's one nice thing about growing up in Manhattan, is that you're a subway token ride away from Marvel or DC or anywhere. So we went up. We claimed we were reporters from the Ramaz Ram. Ramaz was the name of the school. So we figured once we said we're here from the Ram, that they would show us. But Flo Steinberg was very nice. She wouldn't let us in. She gave us some pinups to take home in color, and that was as far as we got to meeting Stan or Jack or any, which was we met Flo. That's which is pretty good. And so I went through phases. The ups and downs, the peak of the first Marvel age, with the Galactus trilogy and the Master Plan, all that stuff that was peak Marvel. And as important, or more important, was the voice of this guy Stan Lee, and the letters pages and the special announcements, and screaming at you from the covers. That, as much as the stories, it was all those little inside notes that made you feel that you were really special for reading this stuff. And then there was I'd say around the period Kirby went over to DC and did the Fourth World. I'd say around that period I drifted away. I drifted more towards underground comics and towards independence and movies. And so then it came around. I went to college. I went to film school, but it was sort of film as not a Hollywood oriented program. Film as fine art. It was like being a poetry major. It was great. It was a wonderful education. Had some brilliant teachers and fellow students. Was totally unprepared for the actual world after I got through. And so I came home, like every kid does. You come home after college. For me, home was the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I said, look, I got a subway token. Where can I go? Maybe they have a job at Marvel Comics. And I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit, but it wasn't a whole lot more. I was offered 2 jobs. I was offered a job to train to be a sauté chef in an Italian restaurant on 3rd Avenue. And I was offered the job to be Larry Lieber's assistant editor in the British department. And I figured there would be less hot oil involved at Marvel Comics. So those are the people competing for my services at that point. And I got the job at Marvel. And I had this lifelong love of Marvel Comics in particular, and the comics medium in general. But to say I had a master plan would be overstating it. It was, it was sort of, I need a job. I'm sick of these crappy office temp jobs I've been doing. Be nice to get my own apartment and not live with my mother. So I got a job. That was my first job as Larry's assistant.
Wow.
So, Danny, that would be, what, 1976?
77. Wikipedia's wrong.
Oh,
never,
no, I mean, I haven't read your Wikipedia,
okay.
but I do know, being a huge Captain Britain person, of course.
Of course.
I remember Larry Lieber's work. Now, this is a question I always ask our guests when they come here, because, I can imagine, being an artist, being a writer, but being an assistant or like an editor, when you first walk in there, it must be like, well, what am I actually going to be doing? It must be a whole new, like, what is it that I'm going to do? What am I getting paid for? You couldn't have had any experience of that.
That's a very good, I mean, I had been one of the editors of my high school literary magazine. I went to Bronx Science, which was in the Bronx. But of course I took all the liberal arts courses there because I wasn't a scientist. It was just a good school. So I had some editorial experience, and I guess I'd seen all those movies with newspaper editors. But you're right. It was, look, every kid of my generation grew up wanting to be Jack Kirby, right? I mean, that's pretty much the job description. How can I get to be Jack Kirby? Okay, well, I'm not, I can draw a little. I passed the famous artist test. I sent in the thing with and astonishingly, they considered me good enough to take the courses. Who'd have thought? So I ended up not taking it for not very interesting reasons. But so I knew, write comics, drawing. Art Spiegelman actually went to the same film program I did in Binghamton. So I had a sense that there were editors in the world, but that's so I knew it wasn't going to be Jack. I probably wasn't going to be Stan. There was only one Stan. But Steve, that's a really good question. What did I think it was going to be? I thought it would be some kind of support job that I could do with whatever kind of visual and language skills I had. And the British books, by the time I got there, was mostly reprint material. So it was more a matter of splitting up the stories and putting new splash pages. There's a little new Captain Britain stuff. Captain Britain's heyday was over.
Yes.
So it was a good way to ease into it. So you're right. I mean, what was my concept? I don't know. It just seemed like, and part of it was described as production manager because there was that aspect to it. We had a little mini British bullpen with a guy named Howard Bender and David Cohen, who was Sal Brodsky's son-in-law at the time. And Sal was the overall head of the department. I don't know. Maybe I was just too stupid and young to even question it. It was just sort of like, all right, well, because I went into the interview with Larry. Larry had been at the Seaboard and come back about a year before.
Yes.
And I went up there on an informational tour maybe 6 months earlier. I ran into a guy I went to high school with who I ended up replacing. And he seemed to think that I had whatever qualifications there were. But I remember I went into the interview with Larry, and my advice to job seekers when you go for an interview in the comic business is make sure you have masking tape, not just on one side of your glasses, but on both sides of your glasses. I think that was the key that got me, whatever it was. Larry and the whole interview lasted like 5 minutes. Larry and I seemed to get along. Then I had to go be interviewed by Sal, who was kind of the overboss of it was kind of the special publications department. And Sal liked me, and then weirdly enough, I went. I think we said I would start in like 2 weeks. So I took myself on a car trip to upstate New York and to Michigan. But I remember being in Cooperstown at the at a motel near the baseball museum the day of the big blackout. And so I called home and I said to my brother, "So what's new?" He said, "There's a blackout. the entire city's going nuts." I said, "Everything seems fine up here in Cooperstown, you know." And then a few days later, I started my job as Larry's assistant.
Wow. Now, Dan, were you a hardcore fan at that time going into Marvel, like working there? Were you hardcore still, or or did a lot of that was passé, or you still had that passion for it?
You know, it's interesting. It's sort of there's two contradictory answers. I was a hardcore fan. I went to this avant-garde film program with filmmakers, brilliant filmmakers nobody ever heard of teaching, and I gained. I mean, I guess I went into this film because I loved things visual, so I had this appreciation. And comics were used. As I said, Spiegelman would come visit because he was an alumnus there, and so I had this appreciation of sequential art, as Will Eisner coined, and I did have this. I was the perfect age to be a Marvel Comics fan as a kid. I think my first Marvel comics were really Millie the Model and the Barbershop, because those are the comics kids gave away.
Yeah.
You know, so I guess I was reading Stan without realizing it. But my first thing where I said, "I'm buying a comic by this new company that doesn't have a name yet," was Fantastic Four #4.
Wow.
That one of my school friends said, "Oh, there's this thing called the Fantastic Four you might like." So I had a love of those first, 6-7 years of the Marvel age. Because it's interesting. I never said to myself it might be fun to work at DC Comics or Carlton Comics. The only thing that in terms of that business and the fried food business, between those two, the only what I said, I want to see if I can get a job at Marvel. But I was definitely not from capital F fandom. I went to, it's pretty funny considering that much of my recent career involves comic book conventions. Because I went to the 1970 Suling show, had a very nice day, and I said, "Well, that was great. Now I never have to do that again." So I became interestingly, I became in many ways more of a fan working at Marvel.
Wow.
And I kicked myself because there was obviously you work in a room with Larry, whatever degree of fan you are, you're in a room with history, right? There's Larry Lieber, right? There were people who I knew as names from my childhood, and I didn't want to invade their space. I figure if you're in your 50s, and that means you've been in the business for 30 years, but if you're in your 50s, and somebody who purports to be an editor, an assistant editor at Marvel Comics calls you up, and they're not offering you work, what are they going to waste your time for? So I never thought of, here are these people who were there at the beginning. I should ask questions. That didn't strike me in quite that way then.
Yeah. Before I turn it over to Steve, I want to say something. When you're talking about, Larry and stuff. I remember the first time I met you was in New York. Remember, I was sitting down with Roy and Dan. But the reason why your face struck me so, like, when I saw your face, it took me back to my childhood, is because, okay, obviously you have a very particular face, but you remember when they did those little profiles, in the comics, and they would draw some of that, the people that worked there. I remembered your face. I remember they had a few other people, but I don't quite remember. So when we were sitting outside eating, me, Roy, and Dan, and then Danny comes and he's like, I remember he goes, "Oh my God, it's Roy Thomas," and I was like, "Oh my God!" It just took me back to that comic book. I think it was in the '90s, and I was like,
probably Steve Busolato drew that.
yeah,
that was a character. That was a caricature of me that I liked, that I thought did what a character is supposed to do. It exaggerates, but I didn't feel. I felt in a good way. I felt it was sort of a friendly caricature version.
Yeah, and you were going to Larry's. I remember you said you were going to. And I was like, but I was kind of like, when I saw you, I was kind of a little mystified because it was little John Cimino looking at you, and I was like, I remember that face. I just had to tell you that. I always wanted to. Steve, take it away, brother. I just had to say.
So we get to the point where you're at Marvel, you're an assistant editor, and if the timeline is 1977, it's still basically just before what we would call the super corporate era. And what I say by that is with the arrival of Mr. Jim Shooter.
Although in retrospect, that looks like a freewheeling zany time,
Yes, obviously, we've had a couple of, legendary creators on the show already, and it sounds like the Wild West, with different editors, other people working on their own books, and then all of a sudden, Jim Shooter comes along, and slowly but surely begins to finalize his power base. And like anyone who's a writer editor is like, well, you can sort of go, and the thing's going to have to be this new Marvel method. What were your feelings at that time, and how did you gel with Mr. Jim Shooter?
Okay, so there's no tough questions. I will be.
I could tell his face right when you said it, Steve. I could feel the heat below me.
It is funny. Look, I mean, I will sometimes joke, but it turns out to be more true than not. I could find a cure for cancer.
Oh.
I could pilot a spaceship to Mars. People would still want to know. So, what was Jim Shooter really like? It wouldn't matter what else I've done in my life. And I mean, Jim is still alive. You can talk to him and ask him yourself. The British department. I mean, I had nothing to compare it. I had nothing to compare. Right? I'm dropped in the middle of this Marvel 1977, and I'm in this obscure, ridiculed side department that literally both our offices had no windows. That's how much respect we got. The editorial office had no windows. The mini bullpen, where Irv Watanabe would come in, Duffy Volan, Mike Esposito would come in once a week to do touch-ups on the reprint plates. So I didn't have anything to compare it to. But my understanding is, after Roy, there was Stan as editor-in-chief, then Roy, but the corporate powers that be. Right, you all know the story, right? Marvel was huge in the 40s and 50s. It imploded in the late 50s. Then the Marvel we know today is what Stan and Martin and Sal and Flo and Larry and Jack and Steve, of course, started building up. But this teeny tiny company that had that Stan, and maybe Stan had an assistant as far as paid staff. So Marvel's building up slowly, and the structure is Stan Lee, 8 titles a month, 2 employees, and a bunch of freelancers. Well, the company grows. Roy comes on, at least so there's some editorial assistants, but then Roy leaves, and the structure doesn't change. It's even though they're now printing 30, 40, 50 titles a month, the structure is still the same as it was when it was Stan and Flo. So that job, I think, became impossible. Right? If you're in comics, that seems like a natural progression, right? You're in the editorial department. Well, okay. So, like in any hierarchy, what's my goal? Oh, the editor-in-chief. Even though in reality, if you look at it, editor-in-chief is just middle management, right? I mean, there's 1,000 corporate, but that sounds very romantic, editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics. But it was this revolving door because I think each of these guys came in, Len, Marv, Archie, Jerry, and they all realized that this was an impossible job, and I guess Roy probably, you know better than I do, but I think Roy must have realized at some point that was sort of an aspect of it too, was the impossibility. You can check with him. I don't want to speak for Roy. But we're off in our little side dungeon, and the British department sort of not, I had my eye on it, but I was trying to do my job. And then Jim became editor-in-chief, and it didn't change a lot. There was still the basic structure. There were a few assistant editors, Scott Edelman and Roger Stern, and so some of those people slowly got promoted. But I was working on the British books until one day a guy named Des Skin shows up. You know that name?
Yes.
Des Skin.
No.
He's like English comic royalty.
Yes,
Oh.
exactly. At that point, he was the publisher of the British Mad. And he came in with this crazy radical idea, which was maybe actual guys from England should be making the British comics and not guys from the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens. although Queens does have the, it's named after the Queen, I imagine, in some way. Anyway, so that's what Marvel decided to do. That the British department, which we always had a small office, or with my counterparts in England. One of the people on the staff there was Neil Tennant, who went on to become Neil Tennant.
Right, Pet Shop Boys.
The Pet Shop Boys. Then he was just Neil from the British department, the British office, who I'd send telexes back and forth with. Or sometimes we go crazy and have these long-distance phone calls. So the British department goes. Sal Brodsky says to me, pick a date when to fire everybody. That was good after a year in the business. Yeah, okay. And, I did what Sal must have known I would do, which is I padded in. I built in like an extra month that people could stick around, including me. And then I became a shared assistant between Sal and Jim Shooter, who were not each other's favorite person. And I worked a lot on Star Wars. I became Archie Goodwin. Of course, I forgot Archie in the mix of editor-in-chief too. So Archie was writing and editing Star Wars, and because the British books used the Star Wars at twice the rate of the American, I became Archie's assistant. So I was working on Star Wars. So there I am, like a year into the business, or less, 6 months into the business, calling up Carmine Infantino and discussing covers with him, which was, and him taking me seriously, like what I said meant anything.
Yeah, that's so cool.
It's so very so I did. So I had what I call the Danny Fingeroth memorial job for like a year and a half, and then I did all those reprint books that I slapped my name on. That various there was like a line of 5 or 6 reprint books, and I knew stuff was going on, but I didn't have the experience in the business, right? I got that there was, oh crap, this thing happened to Siegel and Schuster, and something happened with Jack, and that's why he went to DC in 1970. But he's back now. So whatever happened with Jack couldn't have been that bad because he's back. It was like I was very naive and stupid. So I'm building up to the answer to your question. So Jim, and eventually I ended up in literally January. Well, I guess January 2nd. We wouldn't have been in the office January 1st, but January 2nd, I became Louise Jones, then Louise Simonson's assistant on the X-Men and 10,000 other books. But in the meantime, Jim had taken what had been the editorial model at DC. And wait, hold it. My wife said, "Don't let them see all that crap in the background." Okay, taking the editorial, so you see the different crap. Oh, this is my book and my prize.
I like it.
Thank you. So Jim had started modeling somehow. I don't, and this ask him when he comes on. But whereas the other editors could not do it, he somehow got permission and budget from the upper executive levels to hire more editors and more assistants and to build a company that was modeled on DC Comics of the 40s, 50s, 60s with editorial offices. The idea that one office should edit all the Spider-Man titles may seem like the most obvious thing in the world, but that was not going on. There were 3 different Spider-Man titles edited by 3 different offices, and they tried to coordinate. There was no such thing as a family of books. It was, whoever was hired. There were no editorial royalties, so there was nobody was fighting for the more popular titles. Matter of fact, I'm sure they were happy to not have the popular titles, because who needs all that attention if you're not going to make any more money, right? So Jim built this machine, and Marvel had gotten to this point where they were, screaming highs and screeching lows. There was really my understanding is, again, because I was just in the British department, but it seemed to me, in retrospect, it seems there were writer-editors, but the idea was just stuff was so late that you had to depend on the goodwill and the good faith and the raw skill of the people involved to get the books out the door. And a lot of times they didn't get out the door, so there were lots of reprints. You'd be expecting the climax to a big cliffhanger, and suddenly there'd be like a framing page on either side, and some story from 4 years ago, or some story that had been in the drawer that might be a fine story, but wasn't. So I think the company realized they were losing money doing that. The newsstand business was in decline, and the direct market didn't really exist in any significant way. I say only half jokingly, when I came into the business, the general attitude was, well, this has been fun getting to work on this quaint American folk art. Last one out, please shut out the lights. I mean, that, it seemed that was it. And nobody seemed to be particularly upset about that. This is sort of, we had a good run, and, so I think Jim understood a lot about business, certainly more than most of the rest of us did. And he had figured out, the Jim Shooter legend. As a kid, he was in the hospital, and he kind of analyzed what made Marvel Comics tick, and then he couldn't do it at Marvel because he wasn't good enough for that, but he thought he was good enough for the Legion of Superheroes. And sure enough, he got hired at age 13.
Right.
So Jim had a structured mind. He had an idea in mind of how he wanted things, and how, at the very least, the books could go out on time. And and he had ideas about bonuses, royalties. Because part of, like Stan, he was part freelancer, part, like everybody, part freelancer, part staff guy. There were certain draconian seeming decisions he made. In retrospect, don't seem so draconian. There were people he liked, people he didn't like, and he was complicated. So it could be tricky. But ultimately, I do think there are 2 or 3 people that saved the business in the 80s. I think he's one. Frank Miller is another. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's probably, you can dig down a little more specifically, but I think in general terms, that's as far as I'll go right now.
Well, the reason I say that is because years ago, when I had far more time on my hands, I created a graph of every single title that came out year by year. And I remember looking at 1979, 1980, 1981, and it's like a drought. There is nothing coming out. I mean, in 1981, you had Dazzler. In 1979, you had Shogun Warriors.
I wrote more Dazzler than anybody.
But
paid my rent.
It was tough times. I mean, obviously, at the time, America was going through a ridiculous low point financially.
DC just had their implosion.
Yes, it was dark times, and that's why when you said, a couple of minutes ago about people saying, "Okay, well, I guess this is it," la la la. So you're there at that point. You're right there down at the bottom where people are saying, "Well, I'm going to get my job. I'm going to go into advertising." And then we get this sort of renaissance over at DC. Of course, we have the new Teen Titans coming along. And then over in Marvel, we have the X-Men. And pretty soon you have, Alpha Flight and things are beginning. And people are saying, hey, why don't we publish books that are, $1.50? Marvel fanfare. And it's like, are you crazy? So you're right there. This beginning stage is beginning where the success is happening, and that the direct market has basically is beginning to explode. You're right there. Did you have a sense that something was going on, and you were right there at the cusp, or were you just hanging on by your fingernails?
It's just that thing for me where I didn't have anything to compare it to. I mean, I'd come out of college. I come out of college at this marginal kind of artsy-fartsy department, and I say that in the most loving way. So we were always in danger of having our budget cut, like every other, it's like, we had this equipment held together. The glamorous thing in the department, actually, the thing that gave us some glamour was that Nicholas Ray taught there, the director of Rebel Without a Cause. which was kind of wild. That's a whole other interview. But I mean that it just seemed to be the nature of life in the 70s in America. Every week, whatever you thought you had less the next week. New York was on fire and falling apart, and that the business, I mean, say I'm talking to Carmine Infantino, for instance, about, well, I didn't know, I knew I'd loved Carmine's Flash when I was a kid, obviously it's a great name. You've got to have it's one of the all-time great names in comics, Carmine Infantino, but I didn't know a lot of the backstage, behind the scenes things. I didn't know that Carmine had been up high and down low. I just knew he was Carmine Infantino, and he was so I mean, I took it. There was no internet. There was no way to.
Right.
I mean, again, stuff we take for granted, like, right? Yeah, I'm coming on the show. You Google my Wikipedia page, which is at least 60% correct, and you get some idea of what I've done. We didn't. So I knew that I got a paycheck every 2 weeks. I knew that I was doing freelance work and making some money doing that. I knew. Here's the attitude maybe people still have in comics, this is especially true in the big money days of like the late 80s and 90s. It was I'm making money like a lawyer, but I didn't have to go to law school. So I mean, it wasn't that way then, but I mean, the idea was, okay, I have a job, rents are low, in the 70s and early 80s in New York. I got a job working with cool people. I'm working on comic books, which I had so as far as I was just like not versed in the history of the medium, except knowing I'm working with Larry here. My guest Vito's coming in, Frank Giacoy's, and I have to say I had the sense from some of these guys that maybe they weren't that thrilled with their career choice. That maybe they were still doing it after 30, 40 years because they were stuck doing it. But then you had new people, like Frank Miller and J.M. DeMatteis and Jim Starlin. You had all these people coming in who were enthusiastic. So I would say certainly in those days, nobody coming in there was motivated by money. So the fact that some, and it's horribly naive. I mean, that was, I wish somebody had given us more training in economics and in real life, so that when various things hit various fans at various times, I don't mean comic fans, I mean swirling fans, we would have been more prepared. But no, we lived what we used to say, and again, half joking, but mostly not, which was it beats having a real job. That's
just seems so like free, but it like such a there's something about that type of freedom in a creative atmosphere though. Like I would have been touching the walls. I'm funny. I picture you like touching the walls of the floor. Like, oh my god, that's how I envision it. Because I'd be just like, oh my, even in the bathroom, take a little drink of the water in the bathroom. Maybe you see God or something.
not Marvel. Marvel never. I don't want to get. There was some. Let's say it wasn't the Marvel men's rooms are not that hygienic. Oh no, I was avoiding touching the walls at all costs.
So, Danny, you did mention right there that you wrote issues of Dazzler.
I wrote more issues of Dazzler than any human living or dead.
So now, this is another very important question, I think, for people to get their teeth into. You've been an editor. You were in a little department, off by yourself. You're doing, adjustments and cuttings. How on earth were you given an assignment to actually write a comic, and how were you able to say, yeah, I can do that?
Let me see. Tell the real story. Well, I mean, I was already in the mainstream editorial. At that point, I'd already, worked with Jim, and even though I was shared between Jim and Saul, it was much more, Jim was making much more use of me then in 1980, January 2nd, Louise Jones Simonson. So maybe 2 years later, Louise was the editor of the Dazzler, and as her assistant, the thing that Marvel did then, I'm sure it probably does now too, is they give the assistants comics to edit under the supervision of their boss. So the Dazzler was not perceived as one of the more. It had originally been one of the more important titles. It broke all those records with that issue #1, but it was delegated to me. I had the first really difficult editorial decision of my life to make, and I totally fucked it up, as one does when one gets the first important edit. And the writer justifiably quit in a huff.
Oh wow!
And, I'm home with with a close friend and with my girlfriend, feeling terrible, feeling like I'm probably going to get fired.
Wow!
Because I mishandled this important decision. And the phone rings, and it's Jim Shooter. I said, well, I guess this is it. This is the end of my career in comics. Jim says, how would you like to write the Dazzler? And I go, is that the same as being fired? He said, no, it's an extra freelance, And I'd done a little bit. I mean, I'd always been a writer my whole life, but I'd done some comics writing already. I'd co-written a couple of stories. I'd written a lot of splash pages, but I said, okay. And so under Jim's Jim became the editor, and that is, and look in those days, editorial, especially assistant salaries, were terrible. So I mean, it was understood that the only way to make a living wage was to do freelance work, which everybody did, and so. And plus, Jim actually believed that his editors, aside from making the money, should also have some understanding of what it is to be on that side of the desk.
Right.
So that was how I went from, crisis. I guess it's the crisis presented an opportunity, except I didn't realize it at the time till the phone rang.
Yeah.
Well, you must have many awards for being able to write Dazzler. My humble opinion, drawing a character that's rolling around on roller skates.
Roller skates,
Considering, it was funny that this character comes along in the era of disco, but in England in 1981, there was no disco.
There was no disco. Disco was dead for several years by the time
so it didn't seem to make any sense, but it's definitely a place where obviously you cut your teeth. Now, what was your most satisfying moment at Marvel? What was it?
In the entire 18 years I was there?
Yes, I mean, obviously it's a long time, but there must be something that maybe some people don't know, that you were behind the scenes. You maybe helped to something. You maybe made an adjustment to something, but you yourself are very gratified.
Well, it's there are two answers come to mind. One as a writer, one as an editor. Usually, as a writer, in my case, maybe you'll pitch a story, but then you go through 100 different pitches to even get it considered. Even if you're the regular writer on a title, just to get it past your editor is still, push and pull and negotiation, and this works, that doesn't. I once had an idea for what became Death Trap the Vault, which was a graphic novel we printed as both an Avengers and then to cash in on Venom as a Venom graphic novel. And I wrote it up as like half a page. I gave it to Howard Mackey, who was the Avengers editor. And the basic premise was it's a prison breakout movie with a literal ticking time bomb, and the Avengers have to go into this prison for supervillains and save the day and stop the villains. And and Howard Mackey read it and said, fine, let's do it. So that was kind of, it's nice when an idea you have gets to be close, that's the idea that comes out on paper is close to the, and such a, I didn't have to go through 40 drafts and, reconceive it. Just like, here's this thing. It's a prison, it's a prison breakout movie and a disaster movie all in one. Yes, do it. Okay. And then, one of my favorite moments as an editor, I forget, I think it was either during Maximum Carnage or, dare I say, the Clone Saga. One of those. Yes, the Clone Saga, the highest selling Spider-Man title.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I love the whole Clone Saga. So
okay, but we can get to that. But so we're in a hotel conference room on East 34th Street, not far from where the Marvel offices were then. And I've got all my writers and all my artists in. It's like once a year we bring it. I meet with the writers regularly, but everybody's in, and we're in a conference room, and everybody's jumping up and down and arguing and throwing ideas in, and the phone rings, and it's the front desk, and they said, the conference room next door is complaining that you're making too much noise. And I said, oh yes, we'll quiet down. And I went, woohoo! My people were so enthusiastic and so excited that we're getting calls from the front desk to keep it down. So that was a great moment. Just whether it was due to me or whatever it was we were talking about, or them getting themselves, whatever it was, they were so excited that we had to be asked to quiet down. So that was a cool moment.
Wow, that's cool. Now, Danny, you are in some ways synonymous with Stan Lee, not just hosting a lot of panels, but let's talk. Obviously, your biography is literally, probably, I think, the best. Roy has the Stan Lee story, which was kind of based on his life. It wasn't really his biography, but yours was so good for many reasons, because you played it straight, but you also had your little fanboy stuff in there. It was, and it went so smooth. It really did, and I think it's the best Stan Lee biography ever, the pure biography ever. But my question to you is, when you first saw Stan for the first time, were you working at Marvel, or did you see him before that? What was that? I want to know what it was. Little Danny seeing the guy.
I heard him on the radio on like local New York talk shows.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I was disappointed because there was no way any human could be as brilliant as the guy writing the answers to the letter columns in like the first 20 issues of Fantastic Four. There was no way that, maybe that's why I'm an editor. I mean, I love radio and sound and music. Whatever it was, nothing could be as meaningful to me as those words and the person I imagined. So when I think maybe I was 12 or something. It was on the Barry Gray late night talk show, which was a local New York show, obviously, and it didn't do much for me.
Wow.
Yeah. So I wish I had a more magical answer. Although maybe that's why I went to work at the company, because I wanted to meet those imaginary people in the letter columns, and I wasn't gonna leave till I could, move everything aside and find those gremlins who were really doing the stuff that I loved as a kid.
Wow, that's interesting. And so that's when you heard him. But what about when the first time you actually met him?
Boy, because I worked for Larry, Stan was coming in 2-3 days a week. He hadn't moved to California yet, but he'd pop his head in and say something to Larry, and I wish I had a more dramatic story. It's just sort of he was there. And then say if Larry was out sick or on vacation, maybe Stan always wanted to see the coloring on the British covers, so I'd have to run in and show him stuff. I'm sorry. I have to make up a story because I don't have a great first meeting with. I have some great Stan stories, but they're kind of ones where I already knew him. And oddly enough, I got to know him much better after I left Marvel than when I was at Marvel, because wherever I went, I was the guy that knew Stan. So I developed, and I never claimed, and I think it's good for a biographer, I was never in his inner circle. I was never his closest pal. Certainly was not as close to him as Roy was, say, but he knew, after about, 15 years, he finally because I had these 2 relationships or 3 relationships with Stan. I think I was I was Danny on the phone, I was Danny in email, and then once in a while I was Danny in person. And it took a long time for him, I think, to, I mean, not that he had any reason to figure out that those were all the same person. You know, I don't know how to explain that.
Well,
But I remember there was one point when when I was working at Wizard, which is relatively recent. I was working at Wizard. I was for a time Stan's regular moderator by his and his people's choice. But he was very he couldn't see very well. That he's having vision problems. I remember and I'd said to his people, I said, if Stan has a minute, I'd like to come back and say hello. Before, just to shoot the breeze and say hello. So I, say, okay, come on in. Stan's taking a break, and come in, and we're chatting. And after about 15 minutes, he says, "Oh, you're Danny." Well, I'm thinking, on the one hand, he knows me, but because actually a lot of my relationship with him, Stan was a great emailer, because the reason he was a great emailer, the same reason he was a very dependable freelancer and even staff person, because he never liked to have anything hanging over his head. So if he had an email from anybody he knew at all, he would, I think if you had to wait an hour for a response from Stan to an email is a lot. I'm sure Roy can tell you the same thing. Oh, yeah. So on email and even on telephone, I have some great phone messages from Stan. And clearly in the emails he seems to actually know who I am, remember things from previous emails, things we did together. But in person, maybe because of his vision, maybe he just didn't know who he was looking at half the time. So it was this, and like I said, I mean, I could go on and on with stories about Stan, but but I don't have any great creation story, except that I was one of those kids who loved that person in the comics so much that I wanted to go work for that company.
Wow. Yeah. Go ahead, Niall. Niall, you got something for Mr. Fingeroth?
Yeah, I do, because we're talking about Stan and everything, and then you write this amazing book. Well, my question: why? What made you say I have to do this? I have to write this book. What inspired this?
A bunch of different things. I mentioned my Jewish background. And I do think part of the appeal to me of the comics guys, starting with Stan and Jack and Eisner, and Julie Schwartz, Mort White, that whole crew, they reminded me of my parents and my aunts and uncles. They felt very familiar, even when they were trying their best to not be ethnic and not be specifically anything. But something in there came through to me that really, and especially with the Marvel books, especially with Stan's voice and Jack's voice, Ditko a little different, but Ditko still captured a sense of New York and of power, responsibility, guilt, and so on. So I was intrigued by that story. I was intrigued by the fact that these perfectly intelligent, personable, creative people chose to do this, and or didn't choose, or somehow, and they ended up, instead of doing the classic, second generation immigrant stories of becoming lawyers, dentists, doctors, they were drawing and writing comic books, which a lot of them were very ambivalent about, to say the least. But they were, geniuses at it. And so I've written a book. I've written, among the books I've written is something called "Disguised as Clark Kent: Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero."
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so I get to this point where I want to write another book. I want to write a book, and I want to write a book that would be from a major publisher that I could make some money on, because I'm a full-time freelancer. I don't have a day job doing something else. And I knew Stan to some degree, but really, not to sound too mercenary, but when you make the list of comic book people that you can sell a biography of to a mainstream publisher and get a decent advance from, the list begins and ends with Stan Lee.
Yeah.
And I had been trying, for 5 or 8 years. I had a number of meetings with Stan because at one point the common wisdom was, if it's authorized, it'll sell better, which I don't quite, I get it, but I don't get it. But, and Stan actually considered it longer than I thought he would. one of my favorite Stan quotes, and I will do my Stan imitation, although I don't do it often, is he said, I don't want to do it with anybody. If it was anybody, Danny, I would want to do it with you, but I don't want to do it with anybody. Now, for all I know, I was the 10th person that week he'd said that to, but
Yeah.
but that's, and eventually, and so I wasn't going to do it authorized. And then I kind of I backburnered it for a while. Then Roy and I did that Stan Lee Universe book when Stan turned 85.
Yeah.
And I had gone to Stan's archives, done all this research in the archives, which if you want to take a trip to Laramie, Wyoming, I highly recommend it. There's 200 non-redacted boxes of Stan Lee files there. It's pretty amazing. You have to be willing to take a plane nicknamed the Vomit Comet to get there. So, but it's the American Heritage Center. So I'd sort of gotten a taste of the, and I was getting more and more into history as a historian of some kind, with Superman on the Couch, Disguised as Clark Kent, Rough Guide to Graphic Novels. I'd worked for a guy named Byron Price, who was friends with Stan, and kind of gotten to know Stan through him, and a lot. And all this came together, and at some point, my agent or somebody said, well, try it as unauthorized. Oh, I know. Stan said try it. The last time he turned me down, he said, it was a great quote that I've forgotten, but basically he said, do it unauthorized. I can't stop you. I don't, he said it in a much more witty manner than that, but that's basically what he said. Not that I needed anybody's permission by definition to do an unauthorized biography. And so I wrote a proposal, and my agent showed it to a bunch of places, and we had an offer from St. Martin's Press, which is part of Macmillan, and I remember telling Stan, I said, well, I got to at least tell the guy. So Stan said to me, he said, I'm not going to tell people. I think he was concerned then. He was still doing, there's that documentary, and there's some other things. So he was concerned maybe that they would interfere with each other. He said, I'm not going to tell people to talk to you or not talk to you. They can make up their own minds. He said, but I'm not going to do any interviews. I've done too many interviews. Well, I ended up doing 2 really long interviews with Stan for the book. Either he forgot that he said no interviews, or
Probably
he liked me, or who knows what. But and I was really, I won't say they're the last interviews with him because he lived maybe a year and a half longer, but I think they were among the last lengthy. And by that point, I've been doing a magazine for Tomorrow called Right Now Magazine. That's how Roy and I did that crossover for the Stan Lee Universe. And I have no journalistic training, so I learned on the job with that. Just like I learned how to write comics and edit comics, learned while I earned. I sort of learned while I earned with Right Now, and I'd interviewed Stan a number of times, and I interviewed a ton of people, and I thought, okay, now I think I know how to I know that there's no point in looking Stan in the metaphorical face and going, what about Jack? What about Steve? Why? But I'd learned, especially with the older people, because I've been friends with Al Jaffe and Erwin Hazen and Jerry Robinson, and done interviews with them, and just because I lived in Manhattan, not far from them, I basically got to schlep stuff for them, which was great. It's okay with me. So I figured out ways to get, right when you're that old and you've been in the business that long, even if you're alert of mind and sharp of mind, you're going to tell the same stories over and over, And I think I learned how to kind of get a little bit under the surface and come at things a little obliquely to get people to talk about things a little differently and open up their memories and their information. Not necessarily to tell anything scandalous or outrageous, but just to sort of fill in some of the blanks in these stories. And I think, I didn't print the whole interviews with Stan, but I think I was able to get answers from him and that were a little different than his. Because the thing about Stan, which I always found fascinating, especially once I did start interviewing him on a regular basis in public, I realized a lot of things, but one thing was Stan had a complicated relationship with the truth. You know.
Oh yeah.
But that also included him blurting out incredibly truthful stuff. But you had to listen to it because it would be like boilerplate selling you something, some total bullshit. Boilerplate selling you something, some unbelievably unvarnished, candid truth that you'd never heard before, then selling you something, and all the same tone of voice. So I had to really learn how to listen and pick at those things because he would tell you some incredible, observation or memory or emotion in the same tone that he would say, and you gotta buy my cologne. I mean, it would just, and you had to listen to really. So I think I got pretty good at that. And then the thing about, because Stan started in the business in 1940 at age 18, the history of Stan Lee is the history of the comic book business.
Yeah.
So all those factors together, made me want to do it and made me feel it was something I could do. So that's more or less, it's a combination of love and money and.
Well, Danny, in all honesty, when I read it, you could feel that. I know that sounds, maybe people have said it, but I really did. I could see that you were paying respects to everything, to the positives and the flaws and everything. But I got into it because I knew a lot of that stuff, but the way you did it was almost romantic. I really got it, and I'll honestly say it's the best Stan Lee biography, and I give that nothing but props, and I love it, and even Roy loved it too because he got it before I did, and I said, "How was it?" He goes, "Oh, you got to read it." He goes, "He got everything." He goes, "John, he got the ending right," and I was like, "Oh yeah." So then when I ran to the bookstore, I had one coming in, but I ran to the bookstore and I looked, and I was just like, "Oh, he did it right." Yeah, it was awesome. So Danny, I salute you and just. And just a beautiful book.
Thank you. I worked hard to do that. I tried to make it honest. Look, there's some people who will never be satisfied. Those are the only people I've ever blocked on Facebook. Have been some of those, people for whom Stan can do nothing right. And there's no, they're not interested in a discussion or even an argument. They just want to. But what look, if you look at the book, I report a lot of, I report a lot of great things Stan did, and it's clear I admire the guy, but I report a lot of not so great things he did.
Absolutely.
But I try not to put neon arrows in music. It's like, here, you're a grown up. Here's the information. Do with it. Figure it out. But thank you very much, John. That means a lot.
Absolutely. And before I give it to Steve for the last time, I wanted to say that that about those, I get them all the time too. Just those the purists. They got your factions. You got the Dick Kirbys, you got the Dickos, you got the Lees, and when one's getting some sort of play, and when another's getting play,
somebody when I was out doing a promotional tour of the West Coast for the book, just before COVID in November 2019, I was at the Skirball Center in LA, being interviewed by my old pal Jerry Beck, if you know, the animation historian and producer. Anyway, so I came to the Q&A, and somebody, one of the questions was, why do you think there are people for whom Stan is completely a villain? And it's sort of, an answer clarified itself for me, and I think part of it is, and maybe I'm revealing too much about myself here, but everybody's got a story about somebody that screwed their father, right? If that guy hadn't screwed my dad, we'd be wealthy, we'd be, whatever, but there was this guy or this company, somebody took advantage of my dad and screwed him over, and I'm going to get revenge. And I think that's one framing of the Stan versus Jack, with Jack being as the victim. And it's an easy story to relate to. Stan, although Stan in many ways was as much a victim as anybody, was, he always had an executive position and a well-paying job and a bunch of good lawyers, and Joan, who advocated for him. But it's always easier in that story to identify with the person who's framed as the underdog, which in this case is Jack, and I think there's that sort of primal appeal of that story that goes into people's brains above and beyond facts.
And really quickly, the other thing I also figure with that about the Jack and Stan thing is, I always say it. Stan just got to live longer. He got more of the adulations. Jack
Yeah.
died in '94. He didn't get that, so it was a lot of people like, yeah, Jack should have got that too. And I know that because Stan, despite him passing away, he got to enjoy all that magic and all the adulations, and you got bitter people about that.
But no,
Sad.
Roy, I once asked Roy. I said, there's sort of this part of the mythology is that is that Jack hated Stan since 1941 when he was convinced that that Stan had ratted them out to Goodman about them moonlighting at DC. And I said, Roy, what do you think? And he said he said no, they had a much more complicated relationship. And you can see it with him and with him and Ditko. I mean, I think those relationships were much more complicated than people like to think.
They were human. They were human.
Yeah, I mean, we deal in superheroes. We love to think of heroes and villains in all black and all white, but it's rarely that way.
Go ahead, Steve. Wrap this up. We gotta let Mr. Fingeroth go.
Well, I'm very glad that this last 10 minutes has been related to the book and the project and the work you did, because as we know now, we never got this all-consuming book from Stan. And we have mentioned this on this podcast before. We had Bolajak here, who was his assistant. And I am very aware of the people who he worked with before, who were basically using him as a cash cow. So for me, and I've said it many times, a massive crime was done because he was never given the time at the end there to clear up some stuff in a first-hand account without all that circus hula that we used to get. And so your book, as time moves on, your book is going to gain far more, gravitas as time moves on, because strangely enough, there are a lot of younger people who are now growing up with the concept that Stan didn't do anything. He came in the office, he had a cup of coffee, he said, "How are you guys doing?" and then took all the money. And I literally, my eyes and my brain explodes when I see it. And it's unfortunate that Stan wasn't early enough to get in there and get it done properly, because if I remember rightly, a lot of the criticism of Stan began when he did the Origins of Marvel Comics, when he was doing that stuff. And then people were jumping on him like, well, wait a minute, you did everything? So I want to personally thank you for the book. And I'm telling you, as time rolls on, all this other stuff is going to fade away. And then this book is going to rise to the top of the heap, and people are going to say, okay, this is the closest that you're going to get, okay, to a first-hand account and a true account, and someone that's unbiased, not in either way, not someone who's a hater or someone that's just completely blinded. So I want to thank you personally.
Thank you so much. I will, and I'll just put a quick plug in. I'll put 3 quick plugs in. I did the audiobook. So if you like listening to this, imagine 14 hours of it. and also, I just did audiobooks of my older books, Superman on the Couch and Disguised as Clark Kent. They were never audiobooks till literally last month. But I just want to, is there time for me to make a comment?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was John and Steve. Obviously, I could listen to compliments all night. But and my hat's off to Clifford Meth and Neil Adams for the work they did to protect Stan. I will say, though, certainly the last year and a half, I think you're right. I think Stan was badly used. But before that, this is going to be 2 stories, I guess. So you can trim them down.
No, go ahead.
I was at a Wizard show, I think Sacramento. And Stan was supposed to appear on Saturday with me as his interviewer. And really, all Stan needed from an interviewer was somebody to repeat the questions because he's hard of hearing. I mean, to say I was Stan's moderator is, I'll take the compliment, but really. So he misses Saturday because, and I think it was probably true, he was having a bad reaction to a flu shot. So Wizard sends a plane to get him, and he comes in on Sunday because he doesn't want to let the fans down and probably doesn't want to lose the paycheck, I would imagine. But he shows up, and this guy looks like he's going to collapse. He's holding on to the banister. I really think, well, this is going to be difficult and embarrassing. But, ladies and gentlemen, Stanley and Danny Fingeroth, he comes on stage, and he's, and Wizards and the president of Wizards came on before, and he said, Stan's only going to do 20 minutes, not 45, because he's not feeling well. He didn't want to let you guys down. So people are flashing me signs, it Stan's people, Wizards people, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, stop. And I say to Stan, who's, merrily going along, whereas 20 minutes before he'd been about to collapse. I said, Stan, as you know, John told the people that you can only do 20 minutes. So is there anything you want to say to them before we wrap up? And Stan looks at me and says, is God talking to you? Did he say we have to stop? I feel great. Let's keep going. And so, of course, everybody is still flashing me signs. I have no idea what they mean or what they want, So we went about another 10 minutes. But that was, and I've seen that with people, with older and or ill people. You think they're going to die and they're on stage. So Stan, I'd say yes, probably the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, horrible. But before that, people would say to me, do you think elder abuse is going on with Stan? And as I say, I wasn't in his inner circle, but I said to them, I don't know, but let me ask you a question. Knowing what you know of Stan Lee, do you think he'd rather die in front of 10,000 people loving him or home alone in his sleep? What do you think? And, nobody wants to die ever, but I think if Stan had I think Stan, I'm not speaking for him. I wrote a book about him, but I would guess that if you asked Stan that question, he'd say, I'd rather go in front of 10,000 people loving me than under the covers, home alone, with people feeling sorry for me. But definitely those last year and a half, 2 years were a horror show.
Yeah. He fed off that. He was like made for the stage, He's somebody out of vaudeville. He would have been out of vaudeville back in the day.
Yeah.
He showed up. If you can find it on YouTube. I mean, I have never heard Stan Lee say anything about any sport. Stan was not a sport guy as far as I could tell. He shows up at the Super Bowl with Todd McFarlane one year, maybe 4 or 5 years. And he's like, and I did a panel with him shortly thereafter. And I only, and I said, what the hell were you, I guess I knew him well enough at that point to say, what the hell were you doing at the Super Bowl? And his response was, I'm everywhere. He said.
Yeah, it was brilliant. He always had time for the quip, right? In the last meeting, like the last moments of his life, even with Roy there, the first thing he did when he looked at Roy, this huge smile comes on his face, and Roy goes, how you doing, Stan? And he looks at Roy and he goes, Roy, getting to 100 isn't what it was always cracked up to be. And they both started laughing. It was perfect. It was like, wow. And I was right there to see it. And then he goes to the Rainbow Bridge literally 20, 30 hours later. It was magical. But Danny, thank you for that book. And in all honesty, that was a testament to like a down the line professional with love and care that did that. And so I recommend that to everybody. I don't even think there's any other book out there. I know there's some other things, but I don't know. But thank you so much for coming on here. It's a pleasure. We love to get your story off. We're obviously I'm going to ask you to come back on again. You're one of you.
I'll do it.
Yeah, but you almost come in like the vein of a Roy Thomas. Roy Thomas paved the way of that fanboy that comes and he goes all the way. Like he realizes his potential and he just goes up the ladder and he just like it's just wonderful that people like you got into the industry and that it just gave it more of that creative edge because, like you said, that older generation and all that, they were just kind of doing the work and then punching out of the clock and going to the bar after, going to the gin mill, what they call it, they packed it. But thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Great questions. A pleasure to be here. Thanks, guys.
Yes,
Stay well,
thanks,
everybody.
Danny. And,
all right, Steve, we got to get out of here. Mighty Mr. Milner, where we going?
Oh!
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on Pop XP. If you haven't already, make sure to click that subscribe button and also click the bell for notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. Also, don't forget to head on over to Twitter and follow us at the Pop XP and over on Instagram at the Pop XP. Thanks again everyone, and we'll see you soon.